Okay, so the top cover is all sandblasted, cleaned up, repainted. So it's time to start putting it back together. I'm going to have to put this together basically chucked up in a vise. So the first thing I need to do is get these two valves back in. The top cover gasket kit that I got, I think it was a Tisco kit, came with the O-rings with one exception. It did not come with the spool valve O-ring. So I have that O-ring. It's actually a -016 O-ring. The size of that is a 5/8 inch ID with a 1/16 inch cross section. Should be able to find that O-ring pretty easily. I'm going to go ahead and just roll it down onto the valve. First thing I'm going to do is put the springs in. And these are the original springs, I just replated them. You're going to put the spring in and this plunger, and I'm going to try to kind of do it at one time since I have this thing setting flat here. That's going to push all the way in and bottom out. And the next thing is going to be the valve. Now, since we pulled this valve out, you're going to have to kind of press it back in. However, there's not really a good way to press it in, so just like I did with the cylinder, we're going to lightly tap it in. However, on the end of this valve, it is tapered for this ball to seat. So do not damage this chamfer in here, or else the valve will leak. What I'm going to do is use my stud, put a nut on the end of it, and use this as a driver to drive it back in. However, before I do that, I'm going to put some hydraulic oil on it to lube everything up. And whenever we install this, there is a depth to it. It's basically going to come in here to where it sets about right in this general area. So when you look down through these holes, you will see this valve going through it. So just line these ways, or troughs, whatever you want to call them. I'm not sure exactly what the term is for a spool valve, but line those up with these two holes here. And I'm going to go ahead and use my installer just to help me guide it in there. I was hoping that it would line up straighter than what it's wanting to. Let me see if I can gently tap it with a rubber hammer. Getting it started is proven to be a pain, but once you get it started, it should go just fine. Okay, I believe I got mine started straight. And I'm just barely tapping it. I'm not welling on it. Okay, I think whenever I started hammering this and I got down here, that first valve I put in kind of fell down and it's kind of locked itself up there a little bit. So if that happens to you, just switch your socket back on here and just pull your valve out just a little bit and free that up. It just does very well if you can stick it straight up in the air and let gravity help line everything up. Okay, so that valve's back free. Just going to stand it up to try to get it in there. And then I'm going to continue hammering the valve. Alright. So now you can see that the valve is now in there. That first piece we put in is all the way back in this area, and it's sitting right in about here, and then the spring. Then there's the two open pathways on that valve. Alright, so now we're going to drop this ball in here. Now if you took out the one for the draft control lever, the draft control is smaller than this valve. Here again, I'm going to have to stick it straight up in the air. We're going to take that ball and drop it down in. Next thing is this plunger that fits up into this spring, and this is the largest spring up here right now. The one that went back here was the smaller diameter one and thinner wire. So now we're going to take and drop that plunger in, and then the spring on top of it. And all that's going to kind of rest on that ball. Then the last thing is going to be this valve backstop, because the ball itself is the actual valve. Now this O-ring, like I said, came with the Tisco kit, so I don't know exactly what size this one is, but we're going to lubricate everything up and stick it down in here. Now as for these notches, I don't think it matters which way they go, but I am going to take and stick mine up and down in reference to how it would sit on the tractor. Okay, let's get the spring in the middle of it, get it put on, push it down in, and make sure that it seats against, or well, that the O-ring goes in and kind of seals down in there. Which it should just push in with your hand. And then the next piece is going to be the cap. And here's my cap. There is no, there's no need for any kind of sealer on this, because that O-ring there is our seal. Just put that in there and tighten it down. No real torque spec here, just good and tight. So there's a plug installed. So now we're ready to chuck this up in the vise, start building the underside and get it all adjusted out. Okay, so the very first part I'm going to put in is going to be this bushing right here. And the reason I'm going to do that is because this center shaft is held in by these bushings. So you have to put one in, put the rocker here, and then put the shaft in, and then put the other bushing in. The draft spring, I mean all this mechanism, I can put in there even with that rocker in here. The last part will go on will be the cylinder, really. So I actually have this chucked down kind of low in my vise right now, and I do have soft jaws, but I'm kind of resting on where the block off plate would go and the cylinder. So with that out of the way, here's your another money saving tip. These bushings from the tractor stores, I think were like $30 a piece or something, maybe 60, I can't remember now since it's been a while since I bought it. And of course now we got inflation like crazy. I actually bought both of my bushings from McMaster-Carr for the price of one off of the tractor websites. First thing, let's get this thing up here. I'm just going to use my aluminum driver to drive this in. Alright, I got that drove flush. Now this is flush and it is sticking out this side 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. This does fit. Whenever we drive this side in, it's going to bottom out against this, right in this area here. So this may pop out a little bit more, but we're going to start with it flush. The shaft, I've got it all cleaned up and degreased, and I got to put grease back on it. I will grease these splines where the arms go. That's going to be the last thing I do. It'll probably be done actually on the tractor, where the bushings ride and where the rocker will ride, if I can spit this out correctly. All of this area I'm going to put some grease on it. Alright, so now that I got the shaft all greased up, I'm going to set it in here. Then we're going to set our rocker in. Now the rocker is keyed. It's going to set in there in this direction. So you just line the key up. I'm just going to put a little mark here on it to index where my keys is. That way I can kind of line everything up outside of here. There we go. So once you get it lined up properly, it should just slide right in. Okay, so now that that's in, we need to install our other bushing. Now this side's a little more fun because since we have our shaft in the way, I can't use my installer to install it. I can use it to get it lined up and going, but then I'm going to have to take a punch and basically walk around this bushing until I can get it in here and get it seated. Now I'm going to add a little bit of grease here, although I already put some grease on the shaft. And instead of boring you with how to do this, I'm just going to hammer it in and then I'll get back to you once I get it all seated. And we'll go from there. And the next part I'm going to install is going to be our position and control lever. Kit did not come with this O-ring, however it is a -112. It's a 1/2 inch ID, I believe 3/32 cross section, and that fits in there just perfect. I'm going to go ahead and put some grease on the actual pivot shaft, and I went ahead and zinc plated this piece along with quite a few other pieces in this top. It's not original for them to be plated, however that just keeps corrosion at bay. So I'm going to go ahead and stick this through there. And then I'm going to slide the O-ring over it and push it down into the groove. On the inside, we want this lever pointing up. And that's because of the detent on this cross shaft is going to point up as well. And speaking of the detent, we got a little ball and our spring. They're going to slide into the top if I don't drop them. And we're going to put a cap on it with an O-ring. Now this O-ring was in my kit. I think it might have been a spare, I'm not sure. But I'm going to go ahead and use it. And we're going to put that on there and then tighten it down. And as you hear, our detent works. So now we're going to go ahead and put the lever on.
Alright, so here on our position and draft selector, I actually screwed up. And the reason I screwed up is because washer that I took out is not in the service manual or the shop or the parts manual. However, I looked back at my 861, this washer is there. So now I got to put it back in, so don't forget it. So I'm just going to take and grab out this roll pin. Slide my lever off. The O-ring is still there and good. I'm gonna slide the washer back on. Which I always thought this was kind of odd when I put it together anyway. It's like, what was holding that O-ring in there? Put the lever back on. Stick the pin back in it and drive the pin back home. And it works. So, crisis averted.
Slid that on there and we'll reinstall the roll pin. Okay, so there's our selector lever now installed. We can see it working. Alright, so the next parts we're going to install is going to be our draft linkages. This piece cleaned up and replated. This side here has a groove cut in it. That groove there is going to correspond to this pin on our plate. I actually painted this thing backwards. Oh well. That's going to go in there like that. So when we install this, we need to make sure that that groove is towards the top. So I'm going to go ahead and slide that down in here. And I'm going to take our draft linkage and put the cotter pin in it and the clevis pin in it. Like so. I'm going to go ahead and get the cotter pin put in it. So this is going to go down in, this link will go down in this direction. Tell you what, let me go ahead and put the pin in it outside since it's going to allow me to do that. Okay, so I got the cotter pin installed. Go ahead and slide that in there. Like I said, it's going to orient kind of in that direction. Alright, so the next part we're going to install is going to be our position control assembly. This little pin right here is called the cam follower pin. And after all the years of these tractors being ran, this pin wears out. Some of these are worn completely in two, some of them have a little bit of wear, some have hardly any if they've been already replaced. Which I can tell you that this one more than likely has been replaced because there's maybe 10,000ths of wear on it. But whenever we go to set up our adjustment, this has to be replaced and brand new or else your measurements are going to be wrong. So to replace this, you basically are going to just drive it out and then drive a new one in. Now I have this thing sitting on my vise, so I can't use my vise, so I'm going to just take a socket and put a socket around it to support it and drive it down into a socket. Okay, so just have a socket, and I got a hard metal surface here to help support everything. Just line everything up and drive it out. Should come out fairly easily. May fight you a little bit, but should come out. You can kind of see the wear right there where it shines. New cam pin, numbers 374072-S. And basically, drove it out. Yeah, this way it was sitting there like that, so flip this over and just drive it in the short distance. Okay, and just drive that in until it's flush. So now we're ready to set this in there. The manual has you put in the draft and then the position, however you have nothing down here to attach it. I don't know why they tell you to do it that way, but they do. So I'm going to go ahead and put in our selector cam. And like I say, this is another part that I just went ahead and plated. I will go ahead and put a little bit of grease on everything here, just to make everything slide really easily. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and take our position lever and we're going to slide our shaft onto it. And then we're going to slide it in here. I'll put it on there backwards. Yep, I had it backwards. I'm going to go ahead and put this arm here down onto our position and draft selector. And technically I could go ahead and put a cotter pin in that and be done, but I'm going to wait a minute on it. So as we see, here's my arm that goes out to my lift control. And here's my position arm. And as you see, that cam pin is right there following this cam lobe. Now we'll go ahead and add some grease there as well. And go ahead and put some grease down here where our draft will slide on. And then we'll slide our draft arm up and in. Then slide the draft control home. Okay, so we got the draft arm onto our lift arm. Now this gets a washer and a castle nut with a cotter pin in it. And that just needs to be tightened up because it was actually loose whenever I took it apart. So we'll go ahead and stick that on there. And the nut. And one thing I almost forgot on this down here for our draft and selection or position controller, that actually gets a washer on it before the cotter pin, so it's a good thing I didn't put that cotter pin on there yet. And this nut, just tighten it up enough to where you can get the cotter pin in it and still have everything move freely. Which I can tell you, mine's loose. Okay, so I was able to get that pin, that nut just a little tighter. And then we'll stick our cotter pin in it. Alright, so now let's come back over here to our selector. We'll put the washer on it. And a cotter pin. Make sure all these cotter pins are free of anything that's going to move. You don't want something to bind up because of your cotter pin legs. It could potentially loosen your cotter pin. So there's pretty much the mechanism installed. Okay, so now at this point, this is when the manual actually tells you to install your shaft, your bushings, and all that. But as you can see, this is now in the way, so you'd have to work around it. That's why I always do this part first. Yes, it makes it a little more difficult to maneuver this, but this is easier to work with than this guy. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and get the draft plunger and spring and everything up here installed. So the first piece we're going to put on is going to be this plate. Like I said, I kind of goofed. I painted the wrong side. I should have painted this side, but that's good because that'll keep that good and protected. I can always come back and paint this later. We're going to take this plate, slide it over. I'm just going to go in there and you hit that groove in this rod and everything that I showed you. So that's our first part. Our next piece is the spring seat cover. Oh, and I forgot to mention both of these are reproduced. This plate, I would go ahead and replace it because it does get bent over time. This one you may or may not have to. And then we can go ahead and put the bolts in this and get it tightened down. And you want to go ahead and do this because not so much on the row crop model, but definitely on the other models with the bigger spring, you're not going to be able to get a socket on these bolts. We'll go ahead and torque these down to about 35. There's 7/16, so they could probably go a little higher, but there's no torque spec anywhere. So I'm going to do 35 on mine just to be on the safe side. The next part to go on is, I think they call this a seat. And what's funny is this actually has a 9N part number, so that's how long this part's been around. So before we put that piece on there, we have to put in a little felt seal. Once again, it's a 9N part number, 9N529. And that'll just kind of go in this little groove here on the back side. And that'll slide down. And it should go into this plate. Of course, should and will are two different things. And mine might want to fight me just because of the paint. Because of that, I'm going to take this back off. So now, let's instead go ahead and slide this down on, and then we'll put this guy on over top of it and let it kind of draw it down onto it. Just be careful though, because you're going to bend it if you're not careful with this. Okay, let's see if I can draw it over top of it now. Let's torque these back down now. Okay, so before I put the spring and the plunger on here, I'm going to go ahead and put some grease on these threads. And that's just to keep it lubricated in case I have to readjust this thing sometime in the future. You know, I don't want it to corrode up, you know, even though it's plated. Just a little bit of grease won't hurt it. Now, like I said, I had to get a new spring. There's the old one broke. You see how much of it's broke off. Not a whole lot, but it's enough. Yeah, missing about a coil. Now when we go to adjust this thing, we do have to set this preload on this spring. So I'm not going to fully seat it just yet. There's our spring and our plunger. Like I said, I'm pretty sure this plunger is the same, you know, whether it's a row crop or not. Now what, I've got it contacting here, but all of this is still loose, as you can see. So I'm just going to spin it up right now just to take up the slack, and then once it comes time to adjust it, that's whenever I'll actually properly tension this, and I'll be sure and show you and walk you through that process when that time comes. So now it's time to come back down into the center. This mechanism here is going to be loose until I put the cylinder on. So I'm going to go ahead and get the quadrant put on it. Now before the quadrant goes on, but after all this mechanism, we need to install this washer. Now mine has a lot of wear on it. I don't know if that's wear or if it's actually machined that way. It looks more like wear, but I'm going to put that wear back the way it was. And that's going to go in and slide all the way in. So now it's time to put the quadrant up here. Alright, so on the quadrant, we got a new gasket. Comes with her top gasket kit. Slides onto the back of the quadrant. And then the quadrant is going to slide on. I say, I'm like, it should be loose and not need any grease, but felt awful tight there. Now, the bolts on the quadrant do get lock washers, and I am replacing them. And yeah, I know they're a different color, but they're going to get painted anyway. It goes without saying, be sure you install your quadrant in the right orientation. We're going to go ahead and put these in, tighten these all down. Like I said, they're 7/16, torque them down to about 35-ish. It'll be alright. Alright, next part that's going to go on is going to be our friction disc. And multiple different numbers for it. You can read those there. This needs to go on before we put our keyway in. Side, doesn't matter. No grease. It just slides on. Alright, so your friction disc slides on. Next thing is your key. It should just slide in through the groove. It's kind of an easy way to do it if you can't hammer it. Just get a big old pair of channel locks and squeeze it on. And the next part is our aluminum quadrant piece. Hopefully mine will slide on since I had to heat it up to get it off. And it worked great. So the next part is just a washer. and then our spring. And then we got our lock nut. Now how tight you tighten this depends on how hard it is to turn this. So it may take you a couple tries to get the feeling that you like. You may have to wait until you actually put it onto the tractor. But do make sure that the lock portion of the nut is hitting threads. And something else, if you don't have this tight enough, the vibrations from the tractor will make this fall. Because literally this cork of the friction disc is all that's holding your implement in position control. And of course, when you add the lever, it's going to change how it feels and everything as well. Speaking of the lever, it's time to put that on. Now, most of these old tractors, this knob is silver. I think it's just from years and years of use. The videos from promotionals from Ford show this painted to match the tractor. I decided to leave mine as the bare metal. I'm not sure what type of metal this is. It's non-magnetic and it's heavy. So it might be lead. I don't know. But that's going to slide in here and get bolted down. And these, just snug them up. But since they're threading into aluminum, you don't need to honk them down or anything. That, and plus they have lock nuts or lock washers on them. So I'll be completely honest, I think this one down here is pretty bad. I think I'm going to have to actually helicoil this. Probably should have just replaced it. But I believe I'm going to have to pull that out and helicoil it. And one other thing, speaking of that lever, I did replace that lever because this is the one off of the tractor and it is bent and twisted. So this is actually a replacement. It's an original, but a replacement to me. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this back off, and I'm going to go ahead and helicoil this, since we're going to be using this not only for the tractors, but this is going to play a role in adjusting everything as well. So I want this correct and finalized. So let me helicoil that. Alright, so I pulled that back off and helicoiled it. If you don't know what a helicoil is, this is actually what they are. These little inserts right here are the actual coils. These are stainless steel. And it comes with a tap to over tap it and this install tool. And as you see, this came from my local Napa. They usually have these things in stock, multiple different sizes. Basically, you drill it out, you over tap it with this tap, take your installer, spiral it down into the insert, thread it in, and there's a little tang on the insert and you just knock it off. Now you have stainless steel threads versus aluminum or cast iron or steel or whatever, and they work great. I've repaired a lot of stuff with these. But anyway, that's now installed and working. Next piece is going to be the outer edge of the quadrant. This is going to go on here. These bolts I do not have plated yet. I'll probably go ahead and put them on here though, because I really want to get this thing adjusted and get it off of the vise tonight versus having this thing setting up in the air. So I might just go ahead and put this on there and show you how to adjust it. That's the next thing to go on. Just put it on there and tighten these bolts down. And the reason this is important for adjusting, everybody always talks about the stops, because to adjust your draft, you're going to have this all the way up at the stop and then positions all the way down at the stop. Well, these are what they're referring to as the stops. It's these two welded nuts. And I've seen a lot of confusion about that, but that's what you're going to use. The next part I'm going to put on is going to be the cylinder. So I now have to take this lift top and lift it up so I can get the cylinder put on. And that's going to be fun. I got it lifted up now so I can get this cylinder on. Now before I put the cylinder on here, we have 5 O-rings right here on the cylinder that we have to change. And once we get those changed, we can bolt it on. And when we go to bolt it on, we have one bolt that is longer than the other 3. That bolt will go right here into the right rear hole in reference to how this sets on the tractor. So, there's our new O-rings installed. We'll have to kind of lift this arm up. We can slide our cylinder up in, and it has dowels in it that'll line it up. And then we'll stick a bolt in it. Okay, and these bolts don't have any lock washers, and they're going to get torqued to 60 to 80 foot-pounds. Which I'm probably going to wait and do that once I get this thing kind of set on the ground, because I don't have it setting on this vise very well. We need to install our little dog bone. And I go ahead and put some grease on here. As you can kind of see where the edges are really polished. That's the only area you need to grease. And then we can stick that into our rocker. Put the clevis pin in it and put a cotter pin in it. And then our next one's going to be our little turnbuckle. It goes into here and gets a clevis pin and a cotter pin right there. I'm going to try to locate mine. It's on my workbench somewhere, I just don't know where. Told you I'd find it. Okay, so that goes into there. Gets another little cotter pin. Okay, so now, aside from this thing leaning and trying to fall off on me, man, it's really leaning too. Whew. That's scary. I gotta put the right side lift arm on it so I can adjust this mechanism, or adjust everything. Alright, so now we're going to adjust this thing. The first step in adjusting this is to take out all the play in your draft spring. You want no up and down movement. Once you get no up and down movement, give it one more turn. Okay, so that feels pretty good. So now that portion is set. So the next step is to position this arm. To position this arm, come all the way to the bottom. And then you're going to lift this arm up 1/2 inch. That's what I'm going to do. I have a wall back here. And when I look at it, I'm sitting there 27 inches off the wall. I'm going to move it up to a 26.5. Which is pretty much right there. But you need to make sure that this does not move. If you have to, just constantly recheck it. Like they say, like me, I have a great reference point off of the wall. I know I need to be at 26.5 inches. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch down to draft. Now I'm going to move my touch lever to that upper stop. Touch lever's up against the stop. I'm in draft control. Right here is where we're going to make our measurements. And this is actually a filler gauge that I made based off of the original. I can't remember the measurements at the moment. I'll be sure and get those and put them at the bottom of this video. But I'm going to take this gauge and I'm going to slide it in here. I'm pretty close right now, but I am off a hair. So to adjust the draft, we're going to use this turnbuckle. And all I'm doing is turning it to where it pushes my control valve downward to where my gauge has a snug fit. And once I get that, lock that turnbuckle. Okay, and just lock this turnbuckle down. And double check it. Which I'm pretty good. So that's all there is to adjusting the draft. Now, to adjust the position control, switch back to position, use your touch lever and come all the way to the bottom stop, and that is the nut inside of here, just like at the top. It's not the adjustable stop. It is the nuts there. Verify that your arm is still in the correct location. Mine moved a hair. So now we go back to the same spot, only this time we're going to use position. Like I say, I'll get a measurement of this tool. Say the draft is smaller than the position side. And we're going to check it. Now as you see, my position does not go in at all. To adjust position, we're going to adjust this screw down here. Now to do that, we have to loosen this nut. However, don't just take and loosen this nut, you will break this pin off. Take a wrench or adjustable, whatever you got, and hold this little plate here. Then loosen this nut. Okay? So the nut or the bolt on the end of this spring is what we have to adjust now. And for me, I've got to pull this whole assembly up. See, sometimes you can get it to turn the nut on the back, or you may have to actually come in here with a wrench and get it. Okay, so there's my gauge, it just went in. Okay. Verify, make sure the arm's in the correct location. My arm is still good. My gauge is going in. So now, here's the fun part of this. Since I was able to turn this nut and adjust it, I now have to hold that bolt head down here with something to tighten that nut back up. This is where a cheap wrench comes in very handy, because then you can grind it and fix it. Otherwise you have to use something thin, like maybe these needle nose pliers will grab it. Okay, and when you get to a certain point, remember this is going to try and turn, this little plate. So you're going to have to hold that plate. But before you go through that, make sure that your gauge still fits. Mine's a little loose, but there's a couple thousandths tolerance here, so that should be okay. So let's grab the plate and tighten it down. Double check our gauge. And I got a little bit extra there now, but should be okay. So that's how you adjust these. There's not too much to them. However, once you do this step, go back and double check that your draft is still correct. So there again, to do your draft, switch back to draft and go all the way to your stop and double check. And mine's perfect. And of course verify that the arm didn't move. Which, I'm good. It probably moved a 32nd of an inch. So that's how you adjust it. There's not a whole lot to it, it's just the service manual leaves a lot to be desired, because it wants you to have the special tool to hold it and the special feeler gauge. You don't need a feeler gauge, you can use a caliper. I just made a feeler gauge because I got so sick and tired of dealing with it on my 861. So I made it for one job, and now here I got a second, so you know, that's how weird I am. So now this is ready to go back on the tractor. However, I am going to take these arms back off just because this thing is so heavy, mainly because of this cylinder. Taking those arms off will remove quite a bit of weight, and I can manhandle this back onto the tractor easier. Since I went ahead and built the tractor up, I can't use the 861 to set this back on. So these will come back off. We'll get this set on the tractor and I'll bolt them back on. But that's how you rebuild the hydraulic top cover and adjust it. Now it's ready to go back. Alright, so I'm getting ready to put this hydraulic top back on. Alright, the first thing we got to do is we got to put two O-rings here. This is our pressure and our return. And then we're going to put a gasket on here. And you've heard me reference the Tisco kit for this tractor. The one that I bought is an LCR K55-64. And this comes with most of the O-rings you need and all the gaskets. And that gasket's going to lay right there. Sometimes they line up good, sometimes they don't. And here's my O-rings, which these are not wanting to fit in here real well. So I'm probably going to go get some different ones that hopefully fit a little bit better. These are the ones from the kit, and for some reason on my tractor they don't want to stay in the groove. I don't know if it's a temperature thing or what, because I've had these up at my house and the tractor's outside and it's kind of cold this morning. So, but I'm gonna go get some O-rings put on there, and then this will be ready to have the top put on it. Okay, and go about right there. I'll have to.
Looks like it didn't line up.
It's not, but I can maneuver it.
It's lined up.
Alright, so now that I got the top cover sitting on here, I'm just getting some bolts in it. I don't have all the bolts just ready yet. These are actually ones I just had to replace. That's why they're in there. Now on this top plate here, O-rings only, no silicone. And all these O-rings come in your top kit from Tisco. And that just sets down on top there. And these bolts go all the way through into the rear housing. These go just into the top cover. Once we get all these put on, we'll torque this down to 45 foot-pounds on all the bolts. And then we'll be ready to fill it up with hydraulic oil and put the cap on it, and then this is done, other than getting my lift arms put on and the outer edge of the quadrant.